what we're talking about tonight is probably, well, certainly according to the scientists that I've spoken to, there's over 50,000 scientists from around the world who cite this issue as the most important environmental issue that we face, and that is the chemical poisoning of our children, of ourselves and our bodies, but the impacts that it has on our children and their children and generations to come. It's a very, very important issue that does not really receive any of the attention that things like global warming and climate change tend to have. So what we found is that having discussions within communities is actually really inspiring for other people. Some people have more of an awareness and are further down that journey than others. Toxic chemicals have the ability to affect the health and development of our babies and children, and it's something that we're only really now fully beginning to understand. I'm the mom of 2 children. I live in New York City, and as I was coming into land over Regina, I was so impressed by this city compared to the other city that I live in, which is less like a city and more like a zoo, I guess, and feels like it could be, much more toxic and much more polluted. And it's funny because right now in New York, the UN is meeting for its annual General Assembly, and all of the conversations in New York is about Syria and what's happening in Syria and the sarin gas attacks that have been perpetuated against Syrians by Syrians themselves. Parents finding their children. It's a horrific thing. But I think you will all be horrified to know the link that we all in North America share with sarin nerve gas. Why would we have a link with sarin nerve gas? Well, to answer that question, we have to go back to 1938 to Nazi Germany, where sarin was invented by 4 scientists who were looking for a more effective pesticide to use in agriculture. They were looking for a pesticide that was more deadly, more effective, more able to kill widely, and they came up with a real winner. Sarin is far more lethal than something like cyanide. It's an astonishing nerve agent that is based on organophosphate compounds. It was so successful that the 4 gentlemen who discovered it quickly passed it on to the Chemical Warfare Office of the German army, by which point Germany had invaded Poland and the Second World War had begun. And huge factories were set up to start manufacturing sarin pretty quickly. We know with the Holocaust what happened next. And so I was really surprised, and I think you could imagine my horror, when in the research of making Toxic Baby, I found out this fact. Dag, if you can just show that first slide for me. So much of the produce that we will find in our grocery aisles are conventionally, as we like to call it, chemically produced food, are widely sprayed with organophosphates among other types of pesticides. Some of our children's most favorite foods, like the apples that I mentioned there, strawberries, are some of the most widely sprayed produce that you will find. One apple can have as much as 40 different pesticide remnants found on its skin. Our children are literally eating the remnants of the Second World War. And that's something that, as a parent, you find rather horrific because you're the one feeding your children. And nobody's telling us that these things are actually organisms and agents that were used to kill and destroy, and are quite happy for it to be used on produce, and then are quite happy for our children to have to then eat it. And so you get a sense of what the scientists who chose to look into these things are up against. They're up against some big agricultural companies, they're up against some really big chemical companies who make a lot of money and are very successful in producing these items. And I think would quite like this information to not necessarily be out there. I want to show you a quick clip from the film which gives you just a tiny touch of an idea of what the scientists are saying and what they are thinking about this exposure to these chemicals and the kind of things it could be causing. I wanted to find out what the science was saying about how chemicals in our environment could be affecting the health of babies and children. I wanted to know if it was true that even I could have toxic chemicals in my body. And I wanted to know what the consequences of this would be for my child. This is my journey.
There are studies which are looking now at the range of chemical contamination and have been reporting quite alarmingly that our children are exposed perhaps to an even wider range, even higher levels of certain chemicals than parents and even our grandparents.
In your body at this moment, in my body at this moment, we've got between 30 and 50,000 chemicals that our grandparents didn't have in their bodies, simply because they weren't invented yet. And these are chemicals that our bodies are having great difficulty in getting rid of. A lot of the chemicals we cannot get rid of, they just build up in our bodies throughout our whole lives. And we know that a lot of these chemicals also have negative health effects on your body.
Increasingly, we've noticed an epidemic of chronic disease. Rates of asthma have tripled, developmental disabilities have increased, certain birth defects and childhood cancers are on the rise, and increasingly we've identified certain chemicals that are widely used in our environment that have been linked to those diseases.
So, asthma is one of a group of chronic childhood disorders and diseases that we've seen a really strong rise in. And I often say that when I was growing up, I was the only asthmatic child that I knew. But now everyone knows someone who suffers with asthma some way. It's the number one cause of hospitalization for children in North America and in Europe. And it's quite easy to understand that something you breathe in might cause problems with your lungs. I think we all understand that connection in a really deep way. So something like our cleaning products, for example, that we bring into our home and are sprayed full of ammonia and chlorine, have been shown in studies to actually increase the incidence of asthma. And the United States EPA, the US EPA, has announced that indoor air can be up to 4 times more polluted than outdoor air, simply because of the products that we're using in the home and how they're sprayed and how they linger in the environment and how we're not open and access to free air in the way that we are outside. I was really surprised, though, to find out that there's a strong link between pesticides and asthma. So pesticides seem to reoccur. Every time you look at some of these disorders, pesticides are also really strongly linked to autism and the autism spectrum disorders. Now, it's not just pesticides that are a problem. You might be thinking that something like herbicides might be less dangerous. They don't sound quite as toxic, but they're actually pretty bad too. And I want to share with you a testimony from Professor Tyrone Hayes, who has been studying the effects of one of the most commonly used herbicides in the world, atrazine. It's historically used on corn crops, but it's also used widely on canola. And my understanding is that atrazine could be a concern for you guys here in Saskatchewan as well, We have a slide here from Health Canada showing atrazine contamination of well and surface water in provinces. We can go to the next one, Doug. British Columbia, Nova Scotia, Prince Edward Island, Quebec, Ontario, and Saskatchewan. So here's what Professor Tyrone Hayes has to say about atrazine and his frogs. He's a frog specialist.
Most of my research in this area, although it's more broad now, I guess, most of what I've become known for is looking at a chemical called atrazine. It's significant because it is the most common contaminant of ground, surface water, rainwater, drinking water, you name it. In addition to being widespread and persistent, it's active at very low doses in the environment. And it has the ability to cause a hormone imbalance, if you will. It shifts. It causes you to stop making testosterone and to make more estrogen. And if you're a fish, that means that the males don't make sperm and they don't have an interest in mating with females. And our own work, we found the same thing with frogs. The males become chemically castrated. They don't make sperm. They don't show male reproductive behaviors. And in some cases, genetic males completely turn into females.
This picture shows a male frog with eggs bulging from its testes. These frogs were once all males.
I tell people all the time, my frogs are aquatic. And the reason that atrazine, I think, is so potent on them is because they're going through developmental processes where they need the right hormone imbalance. And now you've put something in there that's interfering with all of these complex things that have to happen. But I remind people all the time that we all start out as aquatic organisms. We're not swimming around in water, right? But in the mother's womb, you're basically an aquatic organism. And in the same way that a group of fish or a group of my tadpoles might be trapped in a contaminated environment, in much the same way, the fetus is really trapped in a contaminated environment. In part because the placenta is designed to keep out bad molecules. But again, we're inventing molecules that the placenta's never seen before.
So, as a mother, you can imagine that that's actually, I mean, for any parent, that's something that you don't really want to hear, but I think that when you're a pregnant woman, the understanding that there are toxic chemicals floating around in your umbilical cord blood, in your, the fluid that surrounds the baby, and somehow these chemicals can go from the fluid from your body into your child's body. It's the kind of thing that really makes you think that actually maybe I don't want to have children. It's the sort of thing that makes you really stop. And it's not fair. It's really unfair for women to have to carry that burden, because we're the ones who live our lives, and we take these chemicals into our bodies, and then the chemicals get passed on to the children while they're still in the womb. So I really wanted to know, what does that mean for me? What does it mean for my child? Can these chemicals reach my unborn baby? Is my baby really surrounded by all of this sort of stuff? And it's very hard, as you can imagine, to know for sure what's going on inside the uterus, because we can't test on a baby, we can't test on humans, and we certainly can't go into a uterus and find out exactly what's inside of a fetus or not. But scientists have been able to measure chemicals from taking samples of umbilical cord blood, from taking umbilical cell samples, and they found some very disturbing things. I'm sorry to have to keep telling you about very disturbing things, but I want you to hear what the scientists have to say. So let's just hear from them.
All these compounds pass the placenta. So they go over during pregnancy to the fetus. Every compound we studied basically goes over the placenta. And it goes over in a way that means that the levels in the mother and in the fetus are basically equal. We found all these compounds back in the umbilical cord blood. So the compounds are already before birth in the fetus.
The fetus is very vulnerable. And one of the worries is that what's happening to the fetus and the way it's not being put together quite optimally has consequences for diseases later in life.
It is of great concern to me, and I think it should be to the public as well. And the reason I think about it is that it is so influencing systems that are very sensitive, in a very sensitive period. According to the Barker's hypothesis, there are quite fetal origins of later diseases in adulthood.
Are we raising the most polluted generation in the history of the planet?
As a society, is it just okay to say that it's okay to have polluted babies? It's okay for babies to be born with chemicals already in them. And just in case you were thinking that it's only American and European babies that have these chemicals present, a study came out this summer which showed 137 chemicals present in the umbilical cord blood of Canadian babies. This was a study that came out 2 months ago in the summer. So we're in a situation where we're bringing children into the world that have already been exposed. And they're being exposed because the mothers have been exposed, the fathers have been exposed, and then they get passed on. Now, my concern is always, well, why don't we know about this stuff? I mean, how come we don't quite know about these things so we can say to pregnant women, don't use insecticides in the home? You know, if you live on a farm and farms are being sprayed, maybe you don't want to be there at that particular point in time. I mean, women can make good choices when they have the information that they need to make those choices. I want to go to the next slide, Doug. Actually, we have two more studies. There are so many studies that are now coming out that show, again, these links between pesticide exposure and babies who were in the womb at the time of exposure then developing these forms of leukemia, which are the #1 form of leukemia actually in North America and in the United Kingdom, and I think there's another one after that as well. So that's just an example of some of the studies that are finding these very direct correlations when they go back and they ask women what they have used while they were pregnant, what they were doing when they check their blood, and they find the chemical trespass, and then they follow their children, they see these diseases that come up. As we talked about earlier, the autism, the asthma, the cancer, etc., etc. So the reason why I wanted to make this film is because I felt that parents had a right to know about this. And I want to take a little quick count. How many people here, for them this is something that they don't know that much about, or they've never heard about it before? So, significant number. And so a lot of you know about this, have heard about some of this stuff. Does anybody have any thoughts on what you're seeing and what you're hearing and the fact that you do know about this? That's a great word. It is at a crisis, because every year we invent anywhere between 1,000 to 3,000 new chemicals. So what is it that we can do? Well, there are actually lots of things that we can do, that we should be doing, and there's some things that we must do because we can't do it ourselves. First of all, we can make better choices, but how do we make better choices if we don't know we need to make better choices? And that's the problem. And that's why we need to talk to our friends, sisters, cousins, brothers, relatives, neighbors, and let them know that there are better choices that need to be made. There are safer cleaning products. I mean, eating organically is just the number one thing as far as I'm concerned, because the organic certification is the only way that we know that a certain level has been reached in terms of wanting to protect those crops, those animals that were raised from a chemical introduction that will change the way that those organisms grow, the way that those organisms live. We were saying earlier, actually, that the organic, in fact, it was Marla who was saying that the organic certification actually, in the organic certification, means a lot. And it also gives us great protection against genetically modified organisms, which we haven't even started talking about, but we could probably go on all night. Dag?
Do we know how much of the pesticides that are found in human blood, for instance? Do we know how much is caused by pesticide use in the environment around the person, and how much is caused by pesticide residues in conventional food?
Well, that's a great question. For the Canadian study, the babies that were recruited were all from Toronto. So I'm making the assumption, when I spoke to the researchers, they did not recruit the babies other than when they were in the hospital. Their assumption is that those pesticides exposure came from food, because they weren't living on farms, they weren't living in rural areas, so they would be less likely to have pesticide drift. The other interesting thing to know is that chemical companies have resisted any change in the marketing and selling of their chemicals, because they say that the amount of a chemical that is needed to produce these effects is so huge that no one is ever exposed to that, and that the residues that you find are so tiny. It's something that they call the dose makes the poison. Now, this was a scientific thought that came about when Columbus set sail for America, literally, like a long time ago, and they've consistently followed that through. Studies have shown that the smallest amount of these chemicals have the ability to disrupt the body, because they're mimicking hormones, and hormones occur in the body in very small, finite amounts. It's very tightly regulated thing, the way that the human body goes from one cell to billions of cells. I mean, we'll go from microscopic to a newborn baby in a very short period of time. Every single one of those changes that creates that body, and in the way that we develop, is regulated by hormones. The timing of the pregnancy, the conception, the differentiation between male and female, the timing of the delivery, the kind of labor that you have when you go into labor, how the brain develops, how the heart develops. All of these things are regulated by hormones, very small amounts of hormones. And so now we realize that actually we don't need a large dose of something. A large dose of something will probably kill or maim in a very significant way but the small effects that we're seeing as the body's unfolding later manifest as diseases later on. There you go.
Thank you. Toronto and now Ontario do have a pesticide bylaw. That means they do not use pesticides in lawns. However, there is nothing yet for public housing. And owning a house in Toronto is a very expensive proposition. My daughter lives there. People are usually in rental situation. And in many rental situations there as well as here, the properties will be sprayed for cockroaches or other things on a monthly basis. So I don't think it's an appropriate assumption to think that we got it all in food.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, the thing, when you have sprays like that, they do linger in the environment and you can access them for sure. There's certain pesticides that we know are only used in food. There's certain pesticides that we know are only used in lawns. So you can sort of decipher it from that, but that's a very valid point. And the companion point to that is that our playgrounds are also widely sprayed and our public areas are widely sprayed. And so the relevant municipalities will go in and spray a playground. You may not know about it. They not often have to put up notices about it. And then children go into a playground and they do what children do in a playground. They crawl around on the floor and they touch things. And we also look at small children as small adults. They're not small adults. They have very different behaviors to the way that we live. They put everything in their mouth. They crawl around on the floor. They lick the floor. I mean, I don't know about any of you, but it's not something I've done for a while. And, it means that they have greater likelihood to come across these compounds. The other thing is, well, they're not directly manufactured for children. It's not as if they're chemicals found in toys and children's clothing, which is a whole other scenario, and those chemicals can cause harm as well. But the thing is that if stuff has been sprayed on a slide and a child goes down a slide 15 times, and then they put their hands in their mouth, and then they eat something, and then they spit and they lick that spit, they are going to take in quite a lot of what has been sprayed. So in a situation like that, what is it that you can do? And people often get really shocked and they want to know, why isn't the government doing more? And why isn't the town doing more? And why isn't this doing more? And it's because a lot of the time, no one's telling them that they need to do more. And this is a really important point because we have to be able to understand that we need to advocate for our kids. They are not in a position to be able to advocate for themselves. There's no advocacy that they can do. And at the present point in time here in Canada, there's no major chemical legislation. There is some brewing in the United States. There's a big fight going on over there, and there's a big fight going on in Europe at the minute. And your elected representatives are not going to talk about this. They're not going to propose legislation. They're not going to back legislation unless they know that the people who are putting them into office support it. So part of what we need to do is we need to be very vocal about this. We need to support legislation, and we need to ask questions. And one of the things that I find very effective is when I buy something, I ask, so what's in this? I'm buying a sofa, what's in the sofa? And people who sell sofas say, foam's in the sofa. I say, well, what's in the foam? Foam's in the foam. Well, what's in the foam to make sure that the foam doesn't go up in flames? Because foam is treated so it doesn't go up in flames. Oh, I didn't know that. Yeah, it does. Can you call head office and find out for me? Oh, I can't do that. Okay, well, I will call up head office. What's your name again? So, because I want to tell them that and then you have a really interesting conversation going on where you have someone on a shop floor going, oh my God, there was this woman who came in, she was asking all these questions, and then I'm seen as a crazy person, which is fine. I have no problem in being seen as a crazy person. I'm happily being a crazy person for my kids. But if somebody else comes along and is a crazy person, I'm less of a crazy person, and it's more of, Houston, we have a problem here because there's more than one crazy person coming in here and asking me questions that I can't answer. And then they go to head office and they do their daily reports, what's happening? And they're like, people are coming in and asking about these chemicals, and oh God, or it's not that woman again, is it? And then you have those conversations. And then public pressure starts to do some really incredible things. And I never used to think that I used to have this mentality, like, oh God, we can't do anything about this. When I first found out about it, it was really, really hard for me to feel motivated. And then things started happening, and that's kind of how I ended up in places like this, sort of standing up here doing this, because I realized that people are actually really, really powerful. We are told in subtle ways and not so subtle ways that we're actually really powerless, that, I don't know, our government can go to war, or they can build mines and dig wells and do things that we don't want them to do, and they're going to do it anyway. But what I found out is that actually people are really powerful, because it's people that keep our economies going. If we don't spend, we know what happens. So actually our governments really want us to be happy, they really want us to spend lots of money, they really want us to be the consumer. And the power of the consumer is such that we can change the way the market goes. And we've seen that with organics. I would think that you guys have seen that, right? You know, the consumer says, well, I want an organic version of this. And somebody comes along and makes it, and they buy it, and they make money, and somebody looks at that company making money and think, I want to make some money too. And I like fill in the blank. So I'm going to do that too. And then somebody else looks, and suddenly you have a whole market going on there. I had a really interesting experience 2 years ago. I gave a TED talk. And in fairness to TED, they did not tell me that Johnson & Johnson sponsored the conference that I was speaking at. And probably because I was hugely pregnant at the time, I was 5 days away from giving birth and giving a TED talk in Washington, D.C. The whole thing was a bit of a blur. And I was wandering around seeing all of these J&J posters. I wonder what that's all about, but I really didn't think that much of it, which I should have done, because the opening words of my TED talk is, well, I was really shocked to find out that the #1 preservative in baby care products mimics estrogen when it gets into the human body, and had been found in breast cancer tumors. What I didn't know at the time, because it was being kept a big secret, was that Hillary Clinton was speaking directly after we were, and she was standing in the wings on the side of the stage, apparently in absolute horror with her mouth like, watching me warble on about these toxic chemicals, and I'm pregnant out of here, and my baby's toxic, and my baby's gonna have this, and I'm looking out into the audience, and you know, all of these famous ladies are there, all looking equally horrified by the hugely pregnant lady. And the Johnson & Johnson executives in the audience, apparently, I didn't know who they were, but they were all like, how can we get her off the stage, the hugely pregnant woman who you can't miss for a mile, and replace her with anybody but her? And then on steps Hillary Clinton, and they're like, oh my God, so Hillary heard that whole thing, and that really doesn't bode very well for us. My TED Talk, our TED Talk, Tyrone and I did it together, did not go up for a year, did not go up for a long time. Apparently TED were under a lot of pressure to mysteriously disappear that talk so that it never actually saw the light of day. But I tell you what, within a year of that talk being done, Johnson & Johnson very quietly announced that they were removing 10 highly toxic chemicals, including the ones that we were talking about, from all baby care lines. And then 6 months after that, they removed them. They're in the process of removing them from all of their adult lines. And you would be amazed by how many different skincare lines Johnson & Johnson. So it's everything from Neutrogena. A lot of them I don't know, I've never heard of, but apparently they're really popular. I don't use that stuff. But they're removing all of it. You know, a lot of people were asking for that. And when you ask questions, if you ask them persistently enough, eventually somebody's going to have to answer you. Because if you don't get answers, you will go somewhere where somebody will give you an answer. We've just seen it in the US about 3 weeks ago. Procter & Gamble announced that they were removing formaldehyde from Tide. Formaldehyde was announced last year as a known carcinogen by the EPA. It's been a known carcinogen for a long time, but they finally acknowledged that it was a carcinogen. And there was a petition that went around that many mothers signed, and Procter & Gamble announced that they were bowing to consumer pressure with that line, "We don't think there's anything wrong with these chemicals, by the way, but nobody will buy our product with it, so we're taking it out." So when I realized that this was happening, I was like, oh my God, we can do things, right? We can't do everything. And that's really important to know because, you know, no one should feel like this is their burden alone. We're all in this together. All of our children suffer, and unfortunately some suffer than others. Lower income children suffer more than perhaps my child. I'm not a rich person, but I can get them organic food, you know. I shop at the Co-op, but I can get them organic food. You know, I can make better choices. I can sew them really bad, ugly clothing on my sewing machine that's not full of nasty stain repellent chemicals and stuff like that. But I can make those choices. There are a lot of children in this world who don't have the luxury of that choice because their parents can't do that. So we have to advocate not only on behalf of ourselves, but on behalf of those children as well. But fundamentally, unless we have global regulation, we're going to have a situation that we have now in the United States. And to a lesser extent, or no, actually to the same extent for Canadian companies exporting as well. I was saying this to Dad earlier. The European Union has the strictest chemical restrictions in the world. It's nowhere near as much as we would like it to be, but it's a very good start. And as a result of this, American companies and Canadian companies and Australian companies and any companies that want to sell their products within the EU have to comply, which means that North American companies are shipping less toxic versions of their products to Europe. So for example, if you go to London and you buy a pack of M&Ms, the red M&M is not that fire engine red that we all know and love from over here. It's a much more watery looking red because that particular dye, red 40, has been banned in Europe. So they can't actually sell it over there. So they've repackaged and reformulated that product. And they're selling the repackaged, reformulated product over there, but guess what? They're still selling the original product here. Which sucks. I'm sorry. There's nothing eloquent that you can say about that. That just really is not a very good situation.
One thing that appalls me is that doctors are not focused on preventing disease, and they don't tell us about these things. And I wonder how much they're getting in medical school anyway. Probably not much. And the other thing I just want to mention, 25 years ago I was at university studying environmental sciences, and at that time we were told 4 million metric tons of pesticides and herbicides are sprayed on Saskatchewan. It actually has the highest concentration of pesticides and herbicides. It's got the highest concentration in North America.
Wow. In North America, that's saying something. There's a lot of spraying going on in North America. Thank you for that comment. I mean, first of all, the point that you make about doctors is absolutely spot on. And the gentleman from NYU, who is a brilliant medical mind, said to me that I probably know more about this than 98, and that was being conservative, he said, 98% of all pediatricians practicing today, which quite frankly is ludicrous because I'm a mom, I'm not a doctor. So why is that? Well, you're right, they aren't taught at medical school. In a 4 to 6 year medical degree, there's 2 weeks of what's called occupational training, which tends to focus on things like asbestos and the use of x-rays and radiation and that kind of thing. 2 weeks. None of this is being talked about at all. And so if a doctor wants to know about this stuff, that doctor has to take it upon himself to pay to go to conferences where he might find some random lunatic on the fringe of medicine talking about this stuff. And he might get a couple of ideas, and then he goes online and he does some research and he talks and he meets another crazy person like me, and and that's kind of how doctors are finding out about it. But that is significantly changing as well. The American Medical Association, a very august medical association, announced last year that they supported the regulation of chemicals, that they were deeply unhappy with the situation. They have not said that you need to change the training of doctors, which is probably one thing that they need to say. But what we're hearing, and we're also hearing it from obstetric organizations, the Royal Society of Obstetricians, the American Society of Obstetricians, have both in the past 3 months announced that pregnant women need to be more aware of chemicals during pregnancy. They haven't told them which chemicals, and they've said that they're not quite sure what the situation is. And the chemical companies responded by saying, well, we don't want to scare pregnant women. Now, I was saying this earlier tonight, that I don't understand where they get this image of pregnant women. Women, these kind of like these fairies, these kind of floaty human beings that really can't cope with any kind of pressure at all, because they will they'll have vapors and take to their beds. And I don't know those women. They don't really, all the women I know kick butt. I mean, they're just really amazing. And if you tell them that this is a problem, they will do what they can within their lives to do the best that they can. And that's all you can ask of someone. So we're seeing changes, but it's not happening fast enough. And when you go and see your doctor and you ask your doctor, and your doctor goes, which is what they do, the onus is on you. So I'm sorry, I don't think you can go, unless you have a special doctor, and there are some special doctors out there who try their best. You have to take the responsibility of your health into your own hands. And it has to be about prevention rather than cure. I mean, there's a principle called the precautionary principle, which is really about saying, we can't know for sure, so maybe we should just take some precaution. Now, how can we not know for sure? Well, after the Second World War, it was decided that we could never ever test on humans ever again, because that just really was abhorrent to being a human being. So unless somebody voluntarily offers themselves up for medical testing, we can't use humans as guinea pigs. And humans aren't like animals. The problem with science is that it revolves around a model where you have a laboratory, you have animals, it's sealed, it's all contained, and it's controllable. Human beings are not controllable. They wander around, they do their things, they breathe in air, they eat this, they are bombarded by things. So we can never pinpoint specifically what one thing can do, because we're not exposed to one thing. We're exposed to thousands and thousands and thousands of different chemicals. So that's the first point. And the other point to all the parents in the room is that we parent by the precautionary principle. We put our children in car seats when we get into a car in case we happen to get into a car accident. We don't know for sure that that's going to happen, but if it could cause some harm, we will do the best that we can to try and minimize that harm. So the precautionary principle is alive and well in the way that we parent in the 21st century. Anyway, it's fine, that's what it's all about. Let the baby cry. I'm saying this because I came off a flight recently where my child screamed for 2 hours, and I have the deepest amount of sympathy for anyone in that situation. But the medical thing is really important, because we do know now, there's studies coming through where food in particular has the ability to negate some of the effects that we see. So I just remembered actually that there was a couple more slides. I think there may be 3 more that I want to show really quickly. And one is looking at a study that was done where they took children off of a conventional diet and they fed them organic, 75% organic. It wasn't 100% organic, 75% organic food. And the level of organophosphates and organochlorines that were detectable in their blood beforehand plummeted. They were undetectable in their blood. Now, when I saw that study, I was like, wow, that's really amazing. And I know that in my own life, because in the making of the film, I had my blood tested, and I had no organophosphate pesticides whatsoever in my blood. I had other things. I had a hell of a lot of other things, which is really horrific and horrendous. But I didn't have any organophosphates. I didn't have any BPA, bisphenol A. I didn't have any triclosan. It was really amazing. And those are all chemicals associated with the way that you live your life. So BPA is found in the lining of tin cans. It's a polycarbonate that used to be found in babies' bottles. It's found on thermal paper, so those shiny receipts that you have. Do not let your children play with that. They are getting a dose of BPA. What I now know is I should have asked them to test for BPS, because what they did is they replaced BPA with BPS. Same bisphenol cousin. But hey, we swapped the A for the S, so that should make it better, right? Well, actually, no, it's still estrogenic, which is why we need better legislation, because then if you're going to replace a chemical, we're going to replace it with something better. And you are all, mostly, I think, here agricultural people. I'm sure you've been talking a lot about bees. Everybody's talking about the bees. And so you may know that the big smoking gun now that we're looking at is these neonicotinoid pesticides. They're called neonics. They're a type of pesticide that, as the name would imply, are partly derived from nicotine. And they have been very effective in the job that they've been asked to do. Now, neonicotinoids were brought in to replace organophosphate pesticides. And a lot of these organophosphate pesticides were brought in to replace DDT. So we're seeing a little bit of a pattern here. Oh, there's a problem with this chemical. Oh, we're going to take it off the market and we're going to bring something else in. Oh, that's really bad too. Oh, well, let's take that off and bring something else in. Oh, and that's really bad too. Oh, okay, well, we better... And we're in this constant sort of cycle. We see it for, as I just mentioned, BPA and BPS. We've seen it for PCBs, which were followed up by the brominated and chlorinated flame retardants. So we need to kind of have legislation that looks at that. If you're going to bring something else in to replace this stuff, it has to be something that's not equally as toxic or still toxic. But I want to mention a little study that no one really talks about, no one really knows about, that was done at Duke University. Unfortunately, I don't have a slide for it, but if anybody wants to read it, please email me, and I'm sure you can find my email address easily. It's penelope@toxicbaby.com, and I can send it to you. And researchers at Duke University fed mice BPA. They exposed them to BPA, and then for a control group, and then the other group, they fed them BPA and leafy green vegetables. And they were very impressed to see that somehow, they don't quite know how, there's something within those leafy green vegetables that managed to somehow negate the effects of the presence of bisphenol A. So the mice that was fed leafy green vegetables, and I'm not quite sure how you feed a mouse leafy green vegetables, but I take them for their word, it's a reputable university. They had very little levels, and in some cases they had no levels of BPA whatsoever. So really, there's a lot of exciting work that can be done in this arena. For all of us who know the power of food, we know that food can heal. And it's no surprise that food has the ability to negate some of these effects. Speaking of food, one thing I really want to mention, there's a lot of talk about the contamination of breast milk. Or breast milk, like our bodies, can be polluted. But that does not mean that you should stop breastfeeding your child, because they are finding now compounds within breast milk, and again, they don't know quite what they are. It's all a mystery, it's kind of mumbo-jumbo. Women's breasts tend to be mumbo-jumbo anyway, but suffice to say that they're kind of confused as to why, but there are compounds within breast milk that negate a lot of the chemicals that you find. So that even though these chemicals might be present, the enzymes and the natural antibiotic immune boosting ability of breast milk seems to counteract some of these exposures as well. So, I mean, I would love to see some of the tens of millions of dollars that are spent by the chemical companies in lobbying sort of passed on to actually exploring these options of how we can use the compounds that we know of, that are natural, that are made up of the same things that we as human beings are made up of, how they can protect us against this, because we are at crisis. These chemicals are out there. And there are other things that we can be doing as well. I don't know if you guys are aware of, there was a big furore about arsenic in rice. Do you guys know about that? So they were finding very high levels of arsenic in rice, and the arsenic got into rice as a result of arsenic-based pesticides, lead-based pesticides that were used on cotton fields. Many, many years ago, they stopped growing cotton, started growing rice in these fields, but the pesticides remained, and rice loves arsenic for some bizarre reason, so they were soaking up all of this arsenic. What they found is that if you plant ferns in arsenic-filled fields, that ferns like arsenic too. And so ferns have the ability to pull arsenic out of the soil. So maybe there are other plants that we can be using to pull some of these chemicals out of our soils. That can mean that when we go into plant, that we're not passing on the pesticide burden. The other thing that I want to mention is that we now know that subsequent generations are being affected by this because the genetic codes within humans are being switched on by chemicals. Diseases are caused when the gene code for breast cancer or Alzheimer's or whatever is switched on, which is why you can have a pair of twins with the exact same genetic material. One would have the disease and one would not necessarily have that disease. And so what they're finding is that when chemicals switch on these genetic changes, unless those genetic changes are switched off again, and they don't actually know how to do that just yet, but they do know that they're switched on, they stay switched on for all the generations that follow. So the last slide that we have, you are what you eat, the saying goes, and according to 2 new genetic studies, you are what your mother, father, grandparents, and great-grandparents ate too. So we have this knowledge, knowing that what we expose ourselves to is going to be passed on, and it is a huge responsibility on this generation. I wish it wasn't there. I guess every generation has their burden to carry. This is ours. Which leads us very nicely back to this whole concept of organic and why organic is important and why we should be eating organic and what does that mean for us. And I think that when you're a farmer and you're trying to do the best thing that you can, sometimes it's not easy to be the first in your area to make a change. Sometimes you don't know if you can make a change. Sometimes you're curious, but your farm's been farmed in this way, your dad did it this way, and what will he say if you suddenly do this? You know, the way that we grow our food, the way that we process our food, the way that we prepare our food, and the way that we feed ourselves and our children our food is fundamentally important to us as human beings and how we will continue to evolve. It is of the most importance. There's one thing that we can take away tonight is that, is it worth shelling out that little bit extra for the organic? Yes. Because when your child gets sick or you get sick, you don't want to have to sit down there and ask that question, well, would they not have if I had done that? I mean, we always ask those questions anyway when something like that happens. But we really have to understand that we live in a world where we don't prevent disease, we cure disease, we wait for it to happen, and then we struggle and race around like headless chickens trying to make it better. And it's much easier to try and make that not happen in the first place. And when I think back to the way that my grandparents lived their lives and ate their food and prepared their foods, I'm not saying I want to go back to there. I like having a washing machine, thank you very much indeed, it's very helpful. But I'm saying that we've come so far away from our food and the things that we have traditionally needed in our lives to live fulfilled existences, and that really simplifying things and going back to a less processed, less manufactured way, well, certainly that can't be a bad thing. That's all that I have to say. I don't know if there's anything else that anybody else has to say.
I just want to say that we've learned from history. We've fed this world for 8,000 years till about 1945, 1950 without chemicals. Now in the last 60, 70 years, all of a sudden we're brainwashed to think that you can't do agriculture without chemicals. Those of us that are organic have proven that it's still possible and absolutely viable to farm and feed the planet without chemicals. So I encourage everybody to vote with their dollars and buy organic.
I'm with you, sir. I'm so with you. You know what's really funny? Just to go back to the Second World War, not that I'm obsessed or anything, mind you. You know, when they came to the end of the war, they had a huge stockpile of chemicals, and they had to start thinking about what is it that they could do with all of this stuff, because they didn't quite know what to do with it. And somebody had the bright idea that they can make money out of it, selling chemical warfare. One really good example of that was the big phosphate piles that were stockpiled to make explosives. And they didn't know what they could do with it, but they found out that actually it makes a really good fertilizer. And so they started fertilizing huge amounts of land, because suddenly you had a huge amount of, ammonia. There's a lot of ammonia that was in circulation that was used to make bombs and explosive material. And they wanted to make some money out of it, and they found out that they could use the derivatives of ammonia, I believe nitrogen ammonia, don't quote me on that, but I think one of the compounds that they made from all of this ammonia was used to fertilize crops. You wouldn't have the corn industry that you have today if it wasn't for those ammonia stockpiles. Because corn by itself, without intensive fertilization, just couldn't exist, which is probably why there wasn't, the kind of level of corn that we saw. This is an answer to your question. You're absolutely right. Up until the 1940s, 1950s, and what does that correspond with? The end of the Second World War. We were doing very well, thank you very much indeed. And suddenly we came along and we found all of these compounds that allowed us to farm in ways that was never possible before. The reason why we need so many pesticides, as you probably all know, is because when you have a monolithic farming practice, the pests go crazy. It's like, New Year's Day, birthday, and Mother's Day all rolled into one, because there's only one thing for them to eat, and the other pest that would come in and control them, because there are other things that would be grown within that environment as well, is no longer there. So these things were brought in. They fundamentally changed the way that we manufactured our food. And they did it without even stopping to think about what would be the consequences of suddenly just growing thousands of acres of one particular crop. What would be the consequences of just fertilizing one crop? What are those consequences on the soil? What are those consequences on our diet? What are those consequences on our bodies when suddenly we go from eating a variety of grains and whole foods to suddenly we eat a lot of wheat, or we eat a lot of soy, What are the long-term consequences of that? And I always feel like I'm talking to my son and my daughter whenever I think about this. Have you thought about what the consequences of that action is? No, clearly not. And, this is something that we see time and time again. And it goes back to, reintroducing new chemicals without thinking, what are the long-term consequences of it? We need to ask a lot more questions. And you're absolutely right. We've done a very good job of getting the human population to the point where it is now. I mean, we invented opera and ballet and skyscrapers and all sorts of things, We were doing pretty well. And now we're doing not so well because we're on point to have the first generation that will be more ill and die before their parents. That isn't doing well. So thank you for your comment. It's a very wise observation. Yes?
First, I'd like to say thank you very much for your work.
Oh, thank you. That's a very nice thing of you to say.
Based on what you were saying about stockpiles of chemicals resulting from the Second World War, fluoride in our waters, which is insidious and invasive form of using up those chemicals to our detriment. I have two questions for you. I'm really concerned about ionizing radiation. When we have a situation like Fukushima, and we have this big burst of radiation into the atmosphere, and huge clouds that are going over, dropping down on the organic farms and the organic gardens. Your thoughts on that, as well as, if you would share it, GMOs, because that's another can of worms. So if you'd share, please, and thank you.
Well, those are two cans of worms I'm happy to open out and spill. The Fukushima scenario is it's a very interesting one. And in Europe right now, there's been a big push to get energy from nuclear power stations. And when Fukushima happened, it stopped Germany for a start in its tracks. I mean, Germany, the formidable Germany, the very formidable Germany, put a halt on all of their nuclear power stations and what they were going to do. Because the thing about what Fukushima showed us is that actually all of these assurances that we get about nuclear are rubbish, really. I mean, we can't legislate for every possible thing. It's like Hurricane Sandy in New York. Well, we had no idea that would happen. Well, guess what? The Earth has a tendency of throwing up things that we never knew would happen, and we can't control that. I have to say something that is really upsetting, and that is that the way that our planet exists means that everything circulates, which is why polar bears are amongst the most polluted mammals. The Inuit have the most polluted blood and breast milk, actually, and they live in the most remote places because the things that are in our environment spread. They spread through the air currents, they spread through water currents, and they have the ability to travel from one place to the other. So the dispersal of the Fukushima material clearly has happened. Clearly it's gone somewhere. But the one thing that I don't really see people talking a lot of, and I'm really interested in, is what again, going back to the diet, because if you look at Hiroshima, what happened in Japan, that generation of Japanese clearly should have they did really suffer. I mean, obviously the people who were directly impacted did suffer. But I find it really interesting that Japan as a culture did not suffer. Japan continued to be some of the most long-lived, Japan has a population that continues to be the longest living, bar the French. I suspect it has a lot to do with their diet, because they have a very particular diet. And so what I would like to see is a lot more research into what are the chemical compounds that can protect against radiation? Because we know that they are out there. We just don't really know how they work and if they would work on a larger scale. So those are my thoughts. It is out there. I was recently on the Pacific coast and I was watching just random dead animals just kind of like float up. Turtle today, fish tomorrow. And they've been dead for a while because all their eyes have been eating out. So they've been floating around for a long time and then gradually washed up. And, I just thought, oh my God, it's Fukushima. But I do believe that the examples and the lessons that were learned from Hiroshima, and I don't know if those lessons were learned, but I think people need to start studying what happened there. Because really and truly, the nuclear reaction that happened there should have poisoned all of the Japanese crops, and certainly, you know, all of the surrounding areas in Southeast Asia, and would have meant that they should have had abnormally high cancer rates, and they should not be so long-lived, but they are. So that's my thoughts on that.